A river caught fire, and nobody photographed it. The image that launched the American environmental movement was taken 17 years before the fire it supposedly documented. The Cuyahoga River had burned at least 13 times before 1969, and an entire city had learned, generation by generation, to call it normal. The 1969 fire lasted 30 minutes and was out before a single news camera arrived. Yet it forced Congress to create the EPA, pass the Clean Water Act, and rewrite the legal relationship between American industry and the natural world. This is the story of how a fire nobody saw changed everything. Picture this. It is 1827. You are standing on the eastern bank of the Cuyahoga, where it bends south of the new Ohio Canal Lock. The water is moving, and clear enough to see the gravel bottom in the shallows. Herons stand in the margins. There is a smell of cold fresh water and mud. A boatman poles a flatboat north toward Lake Erie. He is not looking at the water. He takes it for granted. In 40 years, his grandchildren will not be able to imagine it. The Cuyahoga runs 100 miles through northeastern Ohio before emptying into Lake Erie at Cleveland. Its name comes from a Mohawk word meaning crooked river, a reference to its winding course through glacial terrain. Early 19th century surveys by the Ohio Canal Commission recorded the lower Cuyahoga as a clear water river with active fish populations. Its forested banks used by Seneca and Erie peoples for centuries. By 1881, less than 50 years after Cleveland's incorporation as a city, the Ohio Board of Health had already filed its first formal complaint about the river's water quality. The complaint cited oil and refuse deposits of alarming density near the Industrial Bend south of Superior Avenue. At that point, the lower river had already been functionally dead as a fishery for nearly a decade. The transformation from living river to industrial sewer had taken less than 30 years. What arrived next came not as a catastrophe, but as a series of quiet decisions. Each one seemed reasonable. Each one was permanent. Between 1880 and 1910, the lower 5 miles of the Cuyahoga were lined on both banks with steel mills, ore processing facilities, oil refineries, paint manufacturers, and chemical plants. Industry occupied nearly every foot of accessible riverbank with no buffer, no treatment, and no restriction on discharge. Standard Oil of Ohio, founded by John D. Rockefeller in Cleveland in 1870, used the Cuyahoga as a direct discharge channel for petroleum refining byproducts. By 1900, the company processed more than a quarter of all American oil, and the river beneath its facilities ran visibly iridescent with petroleum film. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, whose primary mandate was navigation, dredged the Cuyahoga Channel repeatedly during this period to maintain commercial shipping depth. That process stirred and redistributed toxic sediment while doing nothing to address the industrial discharge creating it. Step inside the year 1905. You are on a barge moving south through the Cuyahoga Industrial Bend at midday. The sky above both banks is brown. The air smells of sulfur and petroleum. On your left, an ore crane drops its bucket into a pile of taconite. On your right, a discharge pipe the diameter of a streetcar extends from a mill wall directly into the water, running a continuous stream of dark effluent without pause. The surface of the river around that pipe does not ripple. It is too thick. The Army Corps of Engineers had officially classified the lower Cuyahoga as a navigation channel rather than a waterway. That legal designation placed it outside the jurisdiction of any environmental protection statute then in existence, making its destruction lawful by default. The same federal agency charged with maintaining the river actively deepened and expanded it for industrial use while possessing no legal authority and no apparent mandate to address the contamination destroying it. What made this system stable was not technology, or law. It was the language used to describe it. Cleveland's Chamber of Commerce promotional literature from 1900 to 1940 consistently described the smoke, the chemical smell, and the discolored water of the industrial valley as evidence of employment and prosperity. One 1922 pamphlet referred to the Cuyahoga Corridor as the most productive river mile in the American Midwest. Cleveland mayors throughout the early 20th century used the phrase working river to distinguish the Cuyahoga from what they called scenic rivers, a distinction that placed the river outside any public debate about ecological value and framed concern about its condition as anti-industrial sentiment. Think about what it meant to grow up in Cleveland in 1948. Your father works at Republic Steel. The river has burned twice in your lifetime, and both times it appeared in the newspaper, but not on the front page. Your teacher calls it an industrial city. The smoke is called proof. The smell is called jobs. You have never seen the river without a film of oil on it, and you will not think of this as strange until someone from outside the city tells you it is. Engineers at Republic Steel and U.S. Steel developed an informal vocabulary to describe the periodic fires on the river surface. Internal memos from the 1940s, later reviewed by EPA investigators, referred to river fires as natural surface reduction events, a phrase suggesting the fire was a form of self-regulation rather than evidence of catastrophic contamination. The phrase self-cleaning river entered Cleveland municipal engineering reports as a semi-official term. The river was so contaminated, it periodically ignited, and the institutional response was to develop technical language that made combustion sound like a natural process. But the river had a way of making its condition impossible to ignore, and it had done so repeatedly in fire. The first documented fire on the Cuyahoga occurred in 1868, a century before the famous 1969 event. Historians and environmental law scholars have since identified at least 13 fires on the river between that year and 1969, occurring with increasing frequency as industrial discharge intensified. The 1952 Cuyahoga River fire was by far the most destructive. It caused over $1.3 million in damage, burned for several days, destroyed a riverboat, and generated extensive newspaper coverage, including photographs showing 5-story flames reflecting off the black water. Close your eyes for a moment and place yourself on a bridge over the Cuyahoga in November 1952. It is late afternoon. The river below you is on fire, not a small fire, but a wall of orange and black stretching 200 feet along the industrial bend. The heat is reaching you from 40 feet above the water. A photographer from the Cleveland Plain Dealer is standing beside you. He is taking the photograph that will, 17 years later, be mistaken for a different fire entirely. Neither of you knows this yet. Between the 1952 fire and 1969, the river surface ignited on at least 3 additional occasions, none of which generated sustained national attention. Repetition had eliminated perceived newsworthiness. 17 years passed. The river continued to receive industrial discharge. And then, on a Sunday morning in June, the smallest fire in the Cuyahoga's history became the one that mattered. At approximately 11:56 in the morning on Sunday, June 22, 1969, sparks from a passing Norfolk and Western Railway train ignited an oil slick on the surface of the Cuyahoga near the Newburgh and South Shore Railroad Bridge. The floating layer of petroleum waste, industrial oil, and chemical debris caught fire immediately. The fire burned for approximately 25 to 30 minutes before Cleveland Fire Department boats extinguished it. Total property damage was reported at approximately $50,000, making it one of the least destructive river fires in the Cuyahoga's recorded history. Imagine approaching from the river road at 12:15 in the afternoon on June 22, 1969. The fire is already out. What you see is a smear of black smoke still rising from the water near the bridge, and two fireboats moving slowly back toward the dock. A railroad worker stands on the bridge looking down at the scorch marks on the girders. A few people have stopped their cars on the road above. Nobody is taking photographs. In 30 minutes, this will be over. In 2 months, it will be on the cover of Time magazine. The Cleveland Fire Department's initial incident report classified the fire as a routine industrial waterway incident, the same classification used for previous Cuyahoga fires. There was no indication in the immediate official response that the event was in any way historically significant. The fire was gone. But something had already started in a newsroom in New York that would prove far more consequential than the fire itself. Time magazine's August 1969 issue ran a major feature on American water pollution, with the Cuyahoga fire as its central case study. The photograph published alongside the story, showing enormous flames and black smoke rising from the river, was an archive image from the 1952 fire. No photographs existed of the 1969 event. The Time feature reached an estimated circulation of 4 million readers and was cited directly in subsequent congressional debate over the Federal Water Pollution Control Act amendments. Multiple senators and representatives referred to the photograph in floor speeches, treating it as documentation of an event it did not depict. Time's editorial decision to use the 1952 photograph was not concealed. The image was labeled as a file photo, but the labeling did not prevent the image from being read as a depiction of 1969, and within months, the 1952 photograph had become the definitive visual symbol of the event it had not recorded. The photograph most frequently reproduced in environmental movement histories as an image of the 1969 Cuyahoga fire depicts a fire roughly 25 times more destructive than the one it represents. The image the nation responded to was, in a precise sense, more accurate than the event it misidentified. The image that made the invisible visible was itself a fiction, and yet the outrage it generated was entirely appropriate because the real conditions it misrepresented were worse than the story it told. What the photograph created was not a memory of a fire. It was a permission slip for a conversation that had been suppressed for nearly a century. Senator Gaylord Nelson of Wisconsin cited the Cuyahoga River fire in his 1969 proposal for a National Earth Day held on April 22, 1970, drawing an estimated 20 million participants. It was the largest single-day environmental demonstration in American history, and a direct driver of congressional attention to pollution legislation. The Environmental Protection Agency was established by executive order on December 2, 1970. In his message to Congress accompanying the reorganization plan, President Nixon specifically referenced the condition of American waterways, with the Cuyahoga serving as the implicit reference case for a river permitted to become an industrial dumping ground under existing law. The Clean Water Act of 1972 introduced for the first time in American law the principle that discharging pollutants into navigable waterways without a permit was illegal. Prior to that act, there was no federal law that directly prohibited industrial companies from dumping waste into rivers. The regulatory gap was not an oversight. It was a reflection of a century of deliberate policy that treated waterways as industrial infrastructure rather than public resources. Think about what you would have seen if you had stood in the Senate gallery on October 4th, 1972, and watched the Clean Water Act pass 74-0. Senators who had spent careers accepting industrial lobbying voted unanimously for a law that made those industries' core practices illegal. What changed was not the facts. The facts had been available for decades. What changed was the story being told about them, and a single burning river, already extinguished before anyone arrived, had changed the story. The law passed. The pipes were eventually capped. The discharge slowed, then stopped, and something began, almost imperceptibly, to return. In 2000, the Cuyahoga River Valley was designated Cuyahoga Valley National Park, the only national park in the United States running through a heavily industrialized urban corridor. The park encompasses 33,000 acres, including sections of the river that were classified as biologically dead as recently as the 1970s. By the 1980s and 1990s, fish had returned to sections of the lower Cuyahoga for the first time in over a century. Bald eagles, absent from the watershed for decades, began nesting along the river's banks in the 2000s. The river now supports more than 40 fish species in its recovered sections. Stand on the bank of the Cuyahoga today, at the industrial bend where the 1969 fire burned. The mill is gone. The discharge pipe is gone. The bridge that was scorched is gone. What you see is a river that looks like a river, moving, catching light, carrying a cormorant low over the surface. Behind you, where the Republic Steel plant stood, there is a flat, concrete pad and a chain-link fence and a sign from the EPA. The steel mills and refineries are almost entirely gone, not cleaned up, but demolished. Their sites left as contaminated brownfields that still leach heavy metals and industrial chemicals into the river sediment. EPA assessments have identified the river bottom in the former industrial zone as among the most chemically complex in the Great Lakes watershed. The river recovered above its own history, but that history remains chemically present beneath it, a buried archive of what was accepted as normal for nearly a century. The river sounds like water now. It is strange how much that costs. The Cuyahoga River burned, and no one photographed it. The image the nation saw was from a different fire, a different decade, a different scale of destruction, and yet, the outrage was real. The law was real, and the river came back. What cannot come back is the century of silence before the fire. The generations who were taught to look at a burning river and see prosperity, who learned to call smoke a sign of health, and call dead water a working river. That is the thing that does not fossilize, that leaves no sediment layer, that no reconstruction can recover. The interior life of a society that had learned not to see what was directly in front of it.